Hellbound, The Devil and the Hunter. Part 1, The Devil in the Cracks of the World. There's a moment just before a storm breaks. When the trees go still, the air turns heavy, and even the birds seem to hold their breath. The world pauses, like it's waiting for something to go horribly wrong. That's how it felt the night the devil came back. Not a devil. Not one of hell's many screaming, twisted spawn. The devil. The morning star. The one even demons won't speak of unless they're begging for mercy. And someone, some damned fool, let him loose. I was nursing the tail end of a bottle of cheap bourbon when the call came through, radio crackling like it didn't want to be part of this. I was off-grid, 100 miles into nowhere, holed up in what used to be a fire lookout station. The walls were peeling, the roof leaked when it rained, and the generator coughed more than it roared. But it was mine. Quiet, secret, defensible. The message was simple. Something had happened in the woods outside a town called Dead Hollow, West Virginia. A compound of backwoods zealots, the Black Benediction they called themselves, had unearthed something buried under a stone older than the bones of the mountains. They were trying to summon the red god in the ground. They didn't know what they were really summoning. And they sure as hell didn't know how to send it back. The site was a perfect circle of ash. 11 bodies, blackened and burned beyond recognition, mouths stretched in permanent screams. Hearts gone, cleanly excised. The 12th? Missing. But the surveillance footage from a gas station a few towns over gave me all I needed. A man, tall, barefoot, walking calmly into frame. No clothes. No fear. Eyes darker than coal, and a smile that didn't reach them. He looked at the camera like he could see through it. Through the glass. Through you. Then he said, "Hell's just a memory now. I have work to do." And he vanished. Tracking something like this isn't like following a werewolf or a vamp nest. Devils don't leave behind claw marks or blood trails. They change the air. They warp people. They rot places like a disease that can't be seen until it's already deep in the bone. I started looking in Oregon first, drawn by reports of a logging town that had gone suddenly and violently silent. Bright Creek. 412 people, down to 31 in a single night. No screams. No gunshots. Just silence. The ones that were left wandered the streets at dawn, mumbling in languages no human tongue should know. Their eyes were glassy. Their mouths were cracked and dry. But when I pressed one of them, a girl no older than 16, she blinked at me like she'd been asleep and said, "He burned without burning." He smiled, and God bled. It wasn't a clue. It was a warning. From there, I followed him east. In Montana, I found a farmhouse turned into a temple. Symbols on the walls that pulsed with something alive. A dog barked once when I stepped over the threshold, then went quiet, tail tucked. Inside, the family had been crucified, alive, upside down, still breathing. But their eyes were wrong, like the soul had been unscrewed and replaced with something ancient and laughing. The eldest boy was seen a week later at a Walmart. New clothes, clean hands, smiling like he didn't know what smiling meant. When a clerk asked if he was alright, he replied, "The morning star is learning. The morning star is remembering." He wasn't running anymore. He was exploring. And with each step, the boundaries got thinner. I tracked down a medium in Wyoming. She was blind and spoke in riddles, but when I told her what I was chasing, her face turned to wax. She said Lucifer isn't fire and brimstone. He's the whisper behind every lie that justifies cruelty. He's the hunger in the wolf and the shame in the sheep. He doesn't need to kill you, she said. He only needs you to listen. I didn't listen to her warning. I rarely do. That night, the stars blinked out, all of them. Not a cloud in the sky. No moon. Just black. The forest around me held its breath. And from the tree-line, something stepped out. He looked like a man. Pale, tall, barefoot in the pine needles. But his eyes, they were empty. Not dead. Not soulless. Empty. Like the space between stars. And when he smiled at me, I felt my knees lock and my heart stutter. "Hello, Jace," he said. "I've been waiting." I don't know how he knew my name. I don't know how he found me. But I knew in that moment that this wasn't going to be a hunt. It was going to be a war. And the devil had already chosen me to be his first opponent. Part 2. The Blood Moon Pact. The desert doesn't whisper like the woods. It moans. A long, hollow wail that rises up with the wind, echoes through bones long buried beneath cracked earth. I drove through that moaning, over brittle sand and forgotten roads, chasing the scent of brimstone toward a monastery that doesn't show up on any map. They call themselves the custodians of the Ninth Gate, though they don't call themselves much these days. They took a vow of silence over a century ago, after the first time they tried to bind the devil. It cost them nearly everything. Now they wait in a scorched place, where time breaks and shadows hold their breath. I'd only heard of them once, from an exorcist in Prague who lost his tongue to a speaking curse. Said if Lucifer ever rose, these monks were the only ones who might remember how to stop him. If they didn't burn themselves out trying. I didn't expect a warm welcome. I got less than that. It was nearly midnight when I reached the ruins. Wind howled through broken archways, and the desert around the place shimmered with heat that wasn't from the sun. Statues watched me from their perches, eroded faces still screaming. Something had happened here a long time ago, something wrong. I felt it in my blood the second I crossed into their perimeter. And still, they let me in. A man in gray robes opened the door without a word. His eyes were milky white, but not blind. They shimmered with heat. He beckoned me inside with 2 fingers, both of them scarred and blackened at the tips. The hall stank of ash and incense. Candlelight flickered across walls painted with sigils that bled if you stared too long. In one room, they showed me a mural, Lucifer falling from the heavens, only instead of wings, he had arms. Thousands of them, reaching down as the world burned up from below. Then, they led me into a chamber carved from salt. Inside, 7 monks sat in a circle. At the center, a bowl of black water. One of them, the eldest, leaned forward. His lips were stitched shut, but his voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the walls. "The devil you chase has already passed through here. He left nothing but ash and hunger. Why do you follow him?" I told them the truth. I'd faced monsters before, but this wasn't about exorcism or vengeance. This was about prevention. The moment Lucifer finishes whatever it is he's begun, there won't be a world to save. Just cinders. I asked them how they stopped him the first time. They didn't answer. They showed me. The visions came when I drank from the black bowl. One taste and my body locked up, every nerve in me screaming. The monks pressed their hands to my chest, and then I fell into a memory that wasn't mine. A field of fire. Chains made of living scripture. A face that shone like lightning and bled like a wound. Lucifer, falling into a pit made of names, true names, screaming laughter that turned the sky black. I watched as monks, faces still young and full of hope, chanted in unison. They weren't casting spells. They were rewriting reality. Stitching the cracks in the world closed with their blood, their breath, their souls. But they didn't seal the devil away completely. They couldn't. They only lulled him into sleep. Trapped him behind a door that could never be destroyed, only hidden. And now, someone had found it. When the vision ended, I was on my knees coughing blood. The monks surrounded me. "There is no sealing him again," the voice in the stone said. "But there is a way to wound him. One way." They showed me a blade. It wasn't metal. It was absence. A void shaped like a dagger, forged from the breath of the first lie ever told. They called it Vel-Zamar, the thorn of unmaking, but they wouldn't give it to me. Not yet. The desert trembled the next night. We felt it in the stones, heard it in the stars. They screamed in frequencies only the damned can hear. Lucifer was close, and he wasn't alone anymore. Something else had stepped into the world with him. The monks stood on the rooftop and pointed east, toward a thunderhead splitting the sky in half. Red lightning danced through it in silence. Beneath the storm, a town I'd never heard of began to wither. Not burn. Not flood. Wither. As if time itself were sick. I begged the monks for the blade. The lead custodian turned, hands shaking. He held out the dagger, not to me, but to his own chest. One by one, the monks bowed their heads and carved their names into the stone floor with their blood. The blade flared white-hot, and shrieked like it remembered being alive. Then, he handed it to me, and whispered something through torn stitches. "The blade remembers sin. Yours and his." I asked what that meant. They didn't answer. They just pointed me back toward the thunder. The drive was hell. The further I got from the monastery, the more wrong the world felt. Buildings leaned at impossible angles. Roads changed shape. I passed people on the highway with mouths sewn shut, not physically, but as if they'd forgotten how to scream. Deer stood frozen in fields, bleeding from the eyes. The devil was changing the rules of reality one breath at a time. The town, Black Hollow, wasn't on any GPS. It didn't need to be. I followed the trail of screaming radios, blackened birds, and children whispering into dead phones. When I arrived, the air was thick. Not with heat, but with presence. Like something was watching from under the ground. At the center of town stood a church. Inside, the pews were filled with statues. Real people, flash-frozen mid-prayer, skin waxy and smooth. Every one of them facing the altar. And behind the altar, him, Lucifer, dressed in a priest's collar, reading from a book that burned without fire. He looked up, smiled. "You're late." Part 3, Ashes of the Living. The church smelled like rot and roses. The kind of scent you might find at a funeral home where the air freshener is working overtime to mask something far worse beneath. Pew after pew of waxen bodies stared forward with blind reverence, their mouths agape, mid-song or scream, frozen in some unholy rapture. The candles were all lit, but the flames didn't flicker. They stood straight and still like they were afraid to move. Lucifer stood behind the altar, clad in a preacher's black, collar crisp, silver chain dangling from his wrist like an afterthought. His eyes weren't glowing. They didn't need to. They were calm. Unnaturally so. Like he had already seen how this ended, and was just savoring the steps. "You're late," he said again, voice honey smooth, so warm it made my skin crawl. I didn't respond. I tightened my grip on the dagger, the thorn of unmaking. Vel-Zamar pulsed in my hand, its absence humming with hunger, vibrating against my skin like it remembered this monster. Or feared it. I stepped between the pews, boots echoing too loudly, every eye on every frozen body following me with invisible pressure. Their pupils didn't move, but I felt their gaze. All of them, watching, waiting. Lucifer gestured with a hand too graceful for the abomination it belonged to. They wanted salvation. So I gave them peace. Stillness. No more hunger. No more time. You should thank me. I stopped 10 feet away. You don't get to talk about peace. He tilted his head, that same half-amused smirk crawling across his lips. "You sound like Michael. Always so dramatic. Everything's a war with you people. You don't even ask why I escaped." "I know why," I said. "You want the gates open. You want the seals broken. You want to finish what you started." He laughed. God help me, it was a beautiful sound. Soft. Musical. Comforting even. That's how you knew it was poison. No, Jace. That was the old me. This time, I'm not here to conquer. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the incense in his breath. Clove and ash. This time, I'm here to remake. The air in the church dropped 10 degrees. The candles died all at once, snuffed by something unseen. And the stillness turned to a pressure, weight, like the ceiling was slowly descending on the room. I lunged. The dagger moved before I did, pulled by instinct older than memory. A scream ripped through my skull, not mine, not his, but the blade's. It remembered him. Lucifer didn't flinch. He caught my arm mid-strike with inhuman speed and held it there, eyes narrowed like a disappointed father. "You came all this way," he whispered. "With such a lovely toy. But you still don't understand." He twisted my wrist. The pain exploded up my arm. I dropped to a knee. "You think this is about good and evil," he said. "About heaven and hell. It never was." He reached down, touched my forehead with a fingertip that burned through bone, and the church shattered. I was standing in ash. A world of it. Gray dunes stretching into nothing. Trees stripped of bark and blackened into bone. A sky without sun or stars. A world post-God. The church was gone. My body too. I was watching myself, distant, flickering. Beside me stood the devil. Not in a preacher's robes anymore. He was wearing my face. Not perfectly close. A mockery. My eyes, but too wide. My mouth, but too many teeth. "This," he said in my voice, "is what's coming." The sky split open. A thing too large to be seen poured through. A sound with form. No color, no shape, just hunger. Cities crumbled beneath it. Mountains fell into the sea. Time reversed and skipped like a broken record. Lucifer turned to me. "I'm not ending the world, Jace. I'm freeing it. Resetting it. All that pain, that rot, that slow crawl of history toward nothing. Why not start over?" And beneath his feet, the ashes began to stir. They weren't dunes. They were bodies. Billions of them. I gasped as reality snapped back. The church exploded in screaming light. Every body in the pews convulsed at once, their mouths widening, splitting at the corners, cracking like dry clay. Eyes popped. Jaws dislocated. From every throat came the same word. Free. Lucifer was gone. The dagger was burning in my hand, searing into my palm, leaving marks I would never be able to forget. I stumbled outside, just as the church began to collapse behind me. Wood twisted, stone cracked, and something beneath it, something massive, rumbled once, then fell silent. I ran until the sun rose. The next morning, I found myself at the edge of town. No people. No sounds. Just a dead place. But in the road, carved into the concrete, was a message. Long, clean gouges. A devil's handwriting. "You have to choose, Jace. Them or everything." And beneath it, a sigil I recognized from the monastery. A warning. A threat. A promise. Lucifer hadn't just returned. He was gathering. Part 4. The Devil's Gift. Some places were never meant to be remembered. The asylum at Reckoner's Hollow wasn't listed in any official record past 1939. A single photograph existed in an old psychiatric textbook, a black and white shot of a crumbling brick facade, windows bricked over, vines strangling the walls. The caption simply read, "Closed due to structural collapse and patient fatalities." But people kept seeing lights in its windows. And in the nearby towns, whispers were spreading like rot. Stories of the Bright One. Tales of voices coming from the snow, calling people by name. Of dead relatives standing at the foot of children's beds, smiling, glowing faintly, speaking in riddles that made their eyes bleed. It was Lucifer's trail. Everywhere he walked, reality tore at the seams. And now, something beneath Reckoner's Hollow was calling to him. Or answering. I arrived at dusk, guided by a map drawn in blood and charcoal by an old preacher who'd gouged out his own eyes to stop seeing the light. He'd scribbled one phrase again and again across the map's edges. He's already inside. The asylum was nestled deep in the Rockies, where snow refused to melt and the wind howled like it remembered the names of the dead. The iron gates were still intact, welded shut long ago. But the front door hung open, swaying just enough to creak. There were no footprints in the snow, not even mine. Inside, the air was thick, not stale, not musty, full, like something breathed it first and left just enough behind to choke. My flashlight flickered every third step, catching glimpses of graffiti that was more etched than painted. Some of it was ancient, some still wet. Down the hallway, a door slammed shut on its own. Another opened. They were guiding me. I passed through what was once the admissions office, now a nest of broken bones and bird feathers. Something had been living here, or dying here, for a long time. Walls peeled like old skin. Beds were chained to the floors. And above every headboard was a name, followed by a word that chilled me more than anything. Replacement pending. I found the security room. Dust-thick monitors flickered on without power, showing grainy black and white footage of rooms that no longer existed. In one screen, a man sat in a padded cell, rocking. Only, he was me. Same jacket. Same scar under the chin. Eyes wide, mouth sewn shut with barbed wire. He looked directly into the camera. Into me. Then the feed went dead. The lights in the asylum began to hum. I followed the sound of movement, down into the lower wards, into a sub-basement not listed on any schematic. There, I found a hallway of iron doors. Thick ones, reinforced. Each marked with a different symbol. Most of them I recognized from my training as wards. Binding glyphs. But they weren't glowing anymore. They'd been burned off. A trail of footprints made of black ash led to the last door, where something was scratched into the metal from the inside. A single word. Remember. When I opened it, I didn't find a room. I found a void. The air vanished. I was standing on a stone platform suspended in nothingness. Stars hung upside down above me. The walls pulsed like lungs. And at the center, floating, was a child. Maybe 10 years old. Pale. Eyes glowing like dying suns. He opened his mouth and spoke with two voices, one high, one deep. He touched me. I saw him. I see you now. I asked who he was. The voices laughed. I am what he left behind. The boy raised a hand, and from the dark below rose shapes, people, shuffling, twitching. Former patients, long dead, eyes glowing just like his. They opened their mouths and screamed in unison. We remember the gift. I raised Belzamar, the thorn of unmaking. The blade vibrated with hunger, its edge pulling the warmth from my bones. I stepped forward, and the boy smiled. He wants you to use it. He wants you to feed it. Every time it cuts, he learns. Every sin it swallows makes him stronger. and I hesitated. For the first time in my life, I hesitated. That's when they lunged. The dead screamed, mouths cracking open like peeled fruit, eyes burning holes in the dark. I swung the dagger, cleaving through the furs, a woman in a straitjacket, head twisted backward, bones creaking with every step. The thorn drank. The others surged forward. I carved my way through them, each kill sharper, faster, easier. The blade sang with pleasure, with need. And then I was back. Back in the hallway, soaked in sweat and ash, kneeling in front of an open door that led nowhere. No void. No boy. Just a single whisper, crawling from the dark. Thank you for remembering. I left Reckoner's Hollow before dawn, driving until the mountains vanished behind me. But the voices followed. And the blade, Vel-Zamar, was heavier now. It had fed. And something inside it had woken up. Part 5, the 13th Gate. There are places so old, the ground forgets what it's holding. The first church of the morning, built on a nameless hill in upstate New York, predates the town around it by centuries. The structure was little more than blackened stone now, eaten by moss, its bell tower cracked and slanted like a finger pointing toward judgment. No record of its founding. No date. No congregation. Just a legend. This is where they buried the key. The blade, Vel-Zamar, led me here. Its hunger grew with every mile, every heartbeat, vibrating louder until it screamed in my bones. It knew. This was where the final gate would open. Where Lucifer would tear the veil for good. And where I would die. The closer I got, the more time broke. My watch spun backwards. My truck clock froze at 13:13. The birds flew in loops. I passed the same roadside cross 3 times, even though I never turned. Shadows moved against the direction of the sun. And behind me, always behind me, was the sound of someone breathing. Not chasing. Not hiding. Just waiting. By the time I reached the first church, I'd aged a decade. The blade pulsed in my hand like a second heart. My memories tangled like vines. People I'd loved now wore different faces. I wasn't sure if I was even real anymore. And I knew, in the marrow of my soul, that was exactly what he wanted. The church doors were open. Inside, pews rotted in strange angles. The air tasted of wet stone and sulfur. And at the altar stood Lucifer, no longer wearing borrowed skin. He was light. Not warm. Not bright. Wrong. His outline burned the eyes. A shape that didn't fit the world it stood in. Voices whispered from inside him, some mine, some my father's, some from people I'd killed. All of them promising something beautiful. You've done so well, Jace, he said. Just one more step. I raised the thorn voice ragged. End of the line. Lucifer chuckled. Oh, my boy. This is just the beginning. He raised his hand, and the church cracked like an egg. The ground opened. From beneath us rose the 13th gate. It wasn't made of stone, or wood, or iron. It was made of moments, memories, lives. A swirling whole of what was and what never should be. A vortex of screaming time. Lucifer stood at its edge, robes burning away into feathers made of shadow. He turned to me, his voice layered with all who had come before. You think you're the hunter? That you found me. But Jace, you were never chasing me. You were chasing your beginning. Because you were made here. On this hill. Forged from the first lie I ever told. And I remembered. I remembered a voice in my crib, whispering lullabies in a dead language. A man with no face, pressing something into my infant hand, a sliver of nothing, a dagger made of silence. I remembered the fire that killed my parents. I remembered my first kill, at 14, when a demon wore my mother's face and smiled. I remembered how good it felt. The thorn didn't just kill monsters. It made them. And I was its first. Lucifer stepped toward me, hand outstretched. Join me. Not as a soldier. Not as a pawn. As my successor. I looked down at the blade. My blade. It was no longer black. It was mirroring me. My eyes. My rage. My need. Everything I hated about myself stared back from the blade's edge and smiled. Was this what he wanted? All along? Not to be freed, but to pass it on. A devil wears many faces, but he only needs one vessel. I screamed and threw the thorn into the gate. It didn't shatter. It screamed. Reality convulsed. The world turned inside out. The sky cracked. And Lucifer laughed. Good boy, he whispered. You finally gave it back. And then everything stopped. Not time. Not sound. Everything. I was alone. The church was gone. The world was unwritten. But I could still move. Still think. Still feel the thorn, even though it wasn't in my hand anymore. It was inside me. Buried. Alive. The gate was gone. But I was still here. Because something had to keep watch. Something had to stand between the cracks, now that the blade was no longer whole. I wasn't a hunter anymore. I was a seer. Now I wait. In places between sleep and time. In dreams where the sky tastes like salt and strangers call me by names I haven't earned yet. Sometimes I see you reading this. Sometimes I whisper. He's still out there. And the thorn remembers. The end.